Today we will be looking at Chapter 8, Ethics and Corrections, Guarding Ethically. To understand how ethical issues arise in the practice of corrections, it is necessary to contextualize the experience of guarding. This contextualization can expose the anxieties and pressures faced by prison officers within the prison environment. For most seeking positions as prison officers, job security and a regular salary are paramount. In many rural areas, working in the prison system represents the only form of employment, and the prison offers the opportunity to remain in the local environment rather than having to travel to the city for work. Lombardo explains that about 1/3 of the officers he interviewed at the Auburn prison considered danger and mental tension as the most dissatisfying parts of the job. From their viewpoint, danger referred not to the likelihood of violent events, but to the unpredictability of a violent occurrence. Most officers consider prison violence a constant probability that might result from seemingly arbitrary events, and they believe in their ability to sense the likelihood of violence through their awareness of behavioral patterns within the prison. Prison officers frequently experience personal challenges for those in prison. It follows the security and control that are fundamental tenets of guard work, because misconduct not only threatens the prison order, but also may impact the officer's personal safety. Concerns for security and order tend to cause officers to view suspiciously any events that interrupt a prison routine. Knowledgeability refers to the need for prison officers to understand the informal rules and processes that shape daily prison interactions and how to avoid being manipulated by those in prison. Prison officers have expressed concerns about the lack of understanding of the situation of those in prison, especially in view of the fact that they want officers to understand their position. Officers feel that they lack support of their supervisors and administrators, and see themselves as working against everyone and feeling isolated from both inmates and supervisors. Programs like work release, education release, and the ability for someone in prison to receive a college education were considered improper benefits for them because, in their view, they are obtaining work while law-abiding citizens were unemployed. The modern era of corrections brought with it a set of written ethical standards for prison officers and management. The Code of Ethics shown in the Probation and Parole Officers Code of Ethics Closer Look box balances the welfare and legal rights of prisoners with obligation towards colleagues and the public. There are specific rules that prohibit corruption in the form of gifts, personal privileges, and conflict of interest. There is also an obligation for staff to report corruption or unethical behaviors, as well as the declaration of commitment to professionals and compassionate service. Commentators and correctional administrators have offered their own views about correctional ethics. Bosch Jr. articulated a philosophy of corrections around the concept of good citizenship. He saw that those who offend, mainly as individuals who have failed in their obligation as citizens after having received fewer benefits from the citizenship than others. According to Voss, the rights of those in prison include the right to safety, adequate education or adequate care, personal dignity, meaningful activity, and ample opportunity for self-improvement and hope for the future. He singles out the issue of punishment as central. He emphasized that it is incarceration itself that is the punishment, and the purpose of incarceration is not to administer additional punishments over and above the inmate's deprivation of liberty. Searching prisoners can also be justified on the grounds of security. The predominant practice of strip searching may be considered as carrying an element of humiliation outside the bounds of proper security consideration. Lipke argues that many countries imprison offenders under the conditions that cannot be morally justified. In relation to conditions of confinement, Lipke makes the case for minimal restriction and reasonably humane prison conditions, in contrast to extreme conditions of confinement. The question, does the essential humanity Kling alludes to simply apply to prisoners, or does it include any right to privacy? The nature of law in a prison would suggest that there is no such right that exists under the law. There are many limits to privacy within a prison, such as prison personnel having access to personal information about an inmate, including his or her criminal history, overall surveillance and control that takes numerous forms, including drug testing, strip and cell searches, tapping of phone calls, and monitoring and control of family visits. The overcrowding with no chance of solitude. The Supreme Court has ruled that there are some limitations that prison officers are subject to that suggest there is some degree of privacy that does exist. In the court case Hudson v. Palmer in 1984, the court ruled that prison cells can be searched at any time to ensure security within the prison, but that this does not permit acts of deliberate harassment unrelated to security concerns. In the case of Bell v. Woolfish in 1979, the court ruled that where an inmate's property was lost or destroyed as a result of a cell search, inmates have no recourse under the law. Some philosophers have argued that those convictions of crimes forfeit all or some of their moral rights. An opposing viewpoint asserts that those in prison should have access to a space for privacy and solitude, but that an inmate's contact with loved ones visiting family should only be subjected to the most minimal supervision. According to Cleaning, a correctional ethic should be considering all the roles that are played by a prison officer, how they interact with one another, how their work is coordinated with that of others working within the system, the connections they make with the administrative structure of the correctional administrative system as well. There are also ethical considerations in relation to the larger society and to institutions such as legislatures. Relationships characterized by stark power imbalances, potential conflicts of interest, or the necessity to make judgment under pressure all call for extra attention to ethics. Margaret Smith argues that the intractable brutalities that inhere in the practice of imprisonment make it extremely difficult to establish any moral basis for the role of a prison officer. Human rights activists have shown how brutalizing and degrading practices continue to exist within our prison systems. Brooks asserts that anything posing as a correctional ethics is a nonsense. The operation of humane correctional system is rendered almost impossible. Correctional practices have retribution as its dominant ideology, and in institutions where the rights of those in prison are easily violated, it is easy to ignore ethical or professional standards of conduct. Discretionary authority may easily entail issues of ethical conduct. Consequently, some say that it is preferable to restrict their discretion even further by increasing the prison's written rules and regulations. Gilbert maintains that administrators should allow prison personnel to use discretion when no policy is in place or when the policy is vague or inconsistent. Prison guards' discretionary authority is shaped less by formal rules than by an understanding of the shared operational value and ethical principles that govern correctional practice. Gilbert calls for formal training to develop an ethical framework within which officers may exercise their discretion. He argues that if officers' discretion are reasonable and in line with legal and ethical parameters, they should not be disciplined for making reasonable exceptions to the rules when they face a complex situation. He recommends that this technique should be encouraged even more in circumstances where abiding by the regulations would be counterproductive or dangerous to security. A major component of prison life for both prison officers and those in prison is the prison guard subculture, which plays an important role in the prison environment as it does to law enforcement. An aspect of that subculture is the informal code of ethics, commonly known as a prison guard code, which outlines the responsibilities that prison officers have towards each other and provides a guidance on how they should exercise their discretion in a specific situation. Kaufman gives a prison officer code that highlights a number of situations where prison officers, in supporting a particular norm, would likely be acting unethically. Many situations in the prison environment might provoke the use of force by prison officers to control an inmate. For example, one study in 1994 found that the majority of use of force incidents involved refusal to enter or exit a cell, disobedience to orders, and arguing or fighting with other people that were incarcerated. The use of force may give rise to the ethical question about whether the force ought to have been used at all, whether excessive force was used, whether the force was justified, perhaps for the purpose of self-defense against an attack. The American Correctional Association Code of Ethics stipulates that members of the ACA must respect the dignity of and individuality of human beings and must be committed to professional and compassionate service. The ACA subscribes to a number of principles in its code of ethics. This includes respect and protection of civil and legal rights for all individuals, and it requires that the members report any corruption or unethical behavior where there is sufficient evidence to justify a review. Correctional agencies commonly have their own distinct rules about the use of force within a prison. An example is the rule applying in Florida, which gives staff authority the use of force on an inmate only when it is reasonably believed to be necessary under the following circumstances: to defend against immediate or already occurring unlawful force, to prevent a person from escaping from the institution, to secure the custody of an escaped inmate, to quell a disturbance, to overcome an inmate's physical resistance to a lawful order, to prevent an inmate from inflicting any self-injury on or from attempting to commit suicide, to restrain an inmate, to permit the administration of medical treatment under the supervision of a physician when treatment is necessary to protect the inmate from a self-injury or death, or to protect the health of others. And force is necessary only when it has been unreasonable to pursue other means of attempting to achieve one of the above objectives. Force is an option of last resort, to be used only after non-force options have been attempted and when ineffectiveness or when the circumstances reasonably preclude attempting or continuing non-force alternatives to achieve one of the above objectives. Any force used must be reasonable, lawful, consistent with current training, and of the minimal amount necessary to achieve one or more of the above objectives. Kaufman's research found that most prison officers were horrified at the extent and nature of violence within a prison. Officers tended to characterize the issues they faced within the prison as moral dilemmas involved in the clash between their own personal ethical standards and the expectation of them as prison officers. In coping with these dilemmas, many officers attempted to avoid actions that would injure inmates by refusing, exploiting, or implicitly to carry out certain duties. As an alternative, some officers might choose to ignore the effects of both their own actions and those of others. Constructing a separate moral world within the prison and living in the world as well as a normal world can provoke behavioral conflicts. Conover explains the position on use of force under various directives, laws, and employee manuals in the state. Deadly physical force can be used in 3 situations: to prevent an escape, in self-defense, and to prevent arson. Officers' use of force in prison takes place within the formal structures and framework of prison rules and regulations designed to control a prisoner's conduct. Sometimes force may be used informally, that is, outside the boundaries that are circumscribed by the rules. The prevalence of serious mental health issues in correctional institutions impacts the use of force. People in prison who act out may not be disregarding rules, but showing symptoms of a mental health crisis. The Crisis Intervention Team, CIT, has been proposed as a model to address issues that arise when officers interact with people with mental health issues. The CIT concept is a multidisciplinary group of people with expertise in mental health trained to respond effectively through techniques such as de-escalation to interactions with people having mental health issues. States are implementing an adoption of the CIT model for use in prisons. Some people are controlled through verbal intimidation and the use of punitive physical force. The purpose of verbal abuse is to humiliate that person and lower his reputation among others within the prison. Kaufman draws attention to the fact that using force has its own limitations because it cannot be dependent upon the guarantee that everybody's duties are completed. A number of criminal prosecutions and appeals involve cases of non-lethal excessive force use that will serve to illustrate some of the circumstances that may give rise to such actions. Those cases would be the U.S. versus Cerrato and the U.S. versus Ferreira. Marquette found that in the context of the officer subculture, fighting an inmate, a person in prison, was seen as an expression of masculinity or machoism. It was also discovered that despite the institution being run as a sizable bureaucracy, Its informal structure appeared to be the preferred mode of management. A 2002 study of correctional staff attitudes to the use of force found that attitudes varied according to the range of factors, including the kind of institution in which the respondent worked, years of service, age, gender, and military service. In one study, it was shown that younger correctional officers supported using force more than older officers did, while in another, it was discovered that age had no impact on the preparedness to use force. A 2004 study found female officers less willing to confront non-compliant males in prison, and that few female officers relied completely on themselves to bring a situation under control. Both male and female officers employed force as well as verbal communication to resolve instances and resorted to force only to avoid injury themselves. They concluded that the exercise of violence by prison officers was not intended as a symbol of their power, but was rather a reflection of their own sense of vulnerability. Investigating the use of unauthorized force, and therefore a form of informal justice, researchers found that some officers used illegal force when they believed that other forms of authority were either ineffective or would entail greater harm to the prisoner, and when the prisoner would not actively resist or report them. The purpose of the extra legal punishment was to teach a lesson and was justified on both sides as a better option than official punishment that might include loss of privileges. Officers also exercised informal justice because of dissatisfaction with the formal punishment imposed by their supervisors for rule violations. Officers argued that those outside the prison, including local and political leaders, had no interest in events inside the prison, accepted no responsibility, and demonstrated no real concern for what was occurring inside the prison walls. Other prison officials explicitly opposed using force, believing it was unproductive given their belief that violence begets more violence. Officers defined self-defense very broadly, so as to anticipate the need to defend themselves. During the 1970s, the Massachusetts prison system relied on brutality and physical coercion, despite the fact that its use has been declining considerably within the United States as a whole for the first half of the 20th century. During that period, prison officers routinely used violence to enforce control. Kaufman concluded that the use of physical coercion failed at Walpole and other Massachusetts prisons because staff were unable and generally unwilling to use the extreme measures that were perceived as necessary to ensure absolute control. She argued that the use of coercion as a technique was a failure because it was not applied to the inmates generally, but had to be enforced inmate by inmate, and because coercion tended to fuel inmates' anger and hatred rather than suppressing their resistance and rebellion. For the use of coercion to be effective over time, staff has to continuously increase the severity of their punishments. Walker examines the attitude of the courts toward correctional use of force, noting that over the decade, the court has limited such force, but that prison officers are still given more latitude than prison officers in the use of deadly force. In the case of U.S. versus Nixon, the U.S. Supreme Court articulated its rationale for the use of deadly force against escaping prisoners, arguing that a determined escapee may kidnap a hostage or kill an officer to commit other unlawful acts to ease his escape. In Whitley versus Alberts, a prison officer shot an inmate during a disturbance, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, governs cases of excessive force within corrections. In the case of Clark versus Evans, the argument was made concerning whether the officer could have used a different means to prevent the escape, or whether he should have used force sufficient only to disable the escaping inmate rather than using deadly force. The court decided in favor of the officer on both issues, holding that there was no duty to use disabling force rather than lethal force. There have been some decisions that have gone against prison officers. Macaulay versus Caddy, in which an officer shot a prisoner during a disturbance while attempting to break up a fight, and in Kenny versus the Indiana Youth Detention Center, where an officer shot an 18-year-old in the process of escaping from the juvenile institution. Walker provides a comprehensive examination of the regulations regarding the appropriate utilization of lethal force in 4 different states. All policy sanctions on the use of deadly force to prevent an escape, and in 2 states, the policy suggests that disciplinary measures will be imposed on prison officers who fail to employ deadly force. The ACA recommends that a policy concerning the use of deadly force should be tailored to the specific institution for which the inmate is escaping. The Federal Bureau of Prisons explicitly limits deadly force by prohibiting the use of firearms in minimum security institutions in extraordinary circumstances. It does not permit the deadly force to prevent an escape, but only when authorized by the warden or when based on a prison officer's judgment that the use of firearms is necessary to prevent the loss of life or egregious bodily injury. All sexual behaviors are prohibited or restricted by correctional laws regarding sexual activity within a prison. Forced and consensual sex are both included in the variety of sexual behaviors, but the latter has received minimal research. According to research, consenting sexual behaviors predominates in the prison industry. Regardless of whether it is consensual, prison sex is seen as a source of danger, according to correctional management. The highest level of sexual victimization was found in a study conducted in 1994 in the Nebraska prison system, where approximately 22% of the males reported being pressured or forced to have sex against their will. Official complaints of sexual assaults or threat of assaults are more likely to be made in prisons with larger populations, but that is less so in a minimum security institution. The Bureau of Justice Statistics from the period of 2016 to 2018 revealed that correctional authorities reported 2,666 substantiated incidences of sexual victimization by another and 2,229 by staff. Human Rights Watch asserts in a 2001 study on male rapes in the American prison that the problem is much worse than the prison administration is willing to admit. Human Rights Watch suggests that persons' failure to report rapes is a response to prison administrators' indifference towards such reports. It is argued that if people in prison can be certain of protection, they would be more likely to report rapes. According to the Human Rights Watch, the response of prison officers to complaints of rape is often inadequate or even callous, and gay men in particular, unless able to show clear physical injury, tend to have their complaints ignored because prison officials tend to assume consent in sexual acts involving gay men. Many officers respond to such charges and complaints with the advice that they should defend themselves against attack. The 2003 implementation of the PREA resulted in training for the prison personnel on the specific rules of the law. After 2 decades of training, researchers looked at how correctional personnel in 6 prisons used PREA and discovered that they did not see it as helpful, but as rather an administrative safety and cultural burden. In September of 2003, President George Bush signed the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, and the U.S. first law was passed addressing the issue of prison rape and sexual assault. The legislation defines sexual misconduct as including consensual sex acts, therefore giving support to the notion that the prison environment is such that inmates are unable to give consent. The purpose of the act includes the following: a zero-tolerance standard for prison rape, prioritizing the prevention of rape in each prison system, devising and implementing national standards to detect, prevent, reduce, and punish rape, collecting data and information on instances of rape, and increasing prison staff's accountability for failure to detect, prevent, reduce, and punish. The law established a review panel of prison rape within the Department of Justice. The panel is required to hold public hearings each year on operations in the county's 3 prisons with the highest and the 2 prisons with the lowest incidence of rape. The law also established the National Prison Rape Reduction Committee that is made up of 9 members with expertise on the subject. The term transgender or transsexual describes persons who are born with typical male or female anatomies but feel as though they have been born into the wrong body. United Nations agencies, the national standard under the U.S. PREA, and the Department of Justice identify transgender people in prison as a vulnerable group because their appearance or manner does not conform to traditional general expectations. Transgender people in prison are at a high risk of being assaulted or of self-harming. These risks require the U.S. prisons to adopt a specific policy about accommodating them. U.S. prisons may adopt one of the two categories for the accommodations: genitalia-based placement or identity-based placement. In the federal prison system, the Transgender Offender Manual was modified with effect from May 11th of 2018 for the stated purpose of ensuring that issues related to prison management and security are included in decisions about allocating of housing to transgender people. According to some research, transgender women prefer to be housed with males because women are vicious. They are worse than men. Their hormones are going all the time. Some transgender women are housed at a discrete group in separate units. In the United States, transgender people are sometimes held in solitary confinements based on the PREA laws for their own protection. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and transgender people have argued that being denied hormone therapy while incarcerated amounts to deliberate indifference to the serious medical needs. In one case in Georgia, the U.S. Judicial Department supported a claim by a person in prison alleging that the state illegally cut off hormone treatment that she had been taking for 17 years. Prison records show that mental health professionals have diagnosed the person with a gender dysphoria, a condition formerly termed gender identity disorder that was used by the American Psychiatric Association. The Department of Justice argued that gender dysphoria may be treated in the same way as other medical conditions. So-called freeze-frame policies apply in many state prisons that allow people to continue any treatment they were receiving before their arrest, but ban expanding or commencing new treatments. Studies reveal the complex sexual relations between males and transgender women, noting that the sexual relationship was often formed in the facility survival by securing male protection. Using data from 315 transgender women incarcerated within 27 California men's prisons, found that the sexual relationship revealed an issue of inmate-partner violence among inmates, as well as the centralization of relationships to their experiences of victimization. In January 2010, it was disclosed by media reports that Italy planned to establish a correctional facility exclusively for transgender prisoners. The solution was rejected by Canada primarily because of the small number of inmates involved. Before 2018, Canada prisons would simply segregate transgender people as a convenient means of resolving the placement issues, resulting in the exclusion of these inmates from social contact and access to prison facilities. Australia takes two different approaches. The first is a social-based perspective that emphasizes the social aspect of identity and how a person self-identifies. The second is a surgery-based approach that considers whether the individual has undergone sex reassignment surgery. In the United Kingdom, guidelines issued under the General Recognition Act in 2011 mandate that an establishment must permit prisoners who consider themselves transsexual and wish to begin gender reassignments to live permanently in their acquired gender. The intentional violation of organizational norms, rules, and regulations by public employees for personal matters. McCarthy examined 122 cases of alleged corrupt practices in the department, which revealed four major offense categories as a miscellaneous category comprising of theft, embezzlement, trafficking, and the misuse of authorities. McCarthy's topography is broadly similar to that discussed by Goldsmith, Halsey, and Grover in 2016, who, rather than focusing only on a particular transgression, employ a framework of correctional integrity within which acts of corruption can be located. Correctional integrity is an overarching concept that encompasses three categories of corruption: organizational climate, structure, and culture. The aim is to focus on the broader environment within which corruption occurs, on the formal authority mechanisms that enable approved purposes and on the informal norms within an organization that are seen as legitimized practices that result in corrupt actions. Petty theft was alleged by inmates in complaints of loss of personal valuables and contraband, claiming to have been stolen during cell searches or handing it over to staff for safekeeping. Trafficking with inmates relates to smuggling contraband into prison for money, drugs, and services, usually of a sexual nature. McCarthy identified a number of contraband items, including drugs, alcohol, money, and weapons, as well as items such as food and reading material. He found that the higher the number of individuals involved in smuggling contraband, the more organized the operation and the greater scope for items being made available. Additional researchers point out that trafficking with inmates was also involved those who exploit relationships with prison officers to make illicit profits in their underground prison economy. Female officers who form relationships with men in prison, a type of conduct termed a fixation on a partner with a history of such crimes as rape, murder, or armed robberies, become vulnerable to corruption. Social media enables those in prison to easily contact people outside of the prison with the aim of having them befriend correctional staff for corruption purposes. Additional research explains how contraband, comprising of weapons, drugs, and alcohol, are easily obtained inside the prison, entering a Sing Sing correctional facility. According to research, some drugs come in during prison visits, but most drugs enter the prison through officers who are paid off to allow their entry. Prison gangs are instrumental in bringing narcotics into the prison, and it has been suggested that they, in effect, provide a form of governance facilitating the supply of goods to inmates who are unable to obtain through institutional sources. Gangs have a comparative advantage in trafficking because inmates are aware that the gangs are prepared to use force to collect payment for drugs sold to inmates on credit. Trafficking methods include gang members outside the prison affiliated inside gangs through throwing drugs, sometimes in tennis balls or sometimes using slingshots over the prison perimeter fence or wall. Embezzlement relates to the conversion of state property or goods to one's own use. Acts involving officers, shopkeepers, and clerks embezzling money from administrative units within the prison system, such as canteens, commissaries, and prison warehouse. The misuse of authority concerns the deliberate abuse of one's discretion for a monetary benefit. The kinds of discretion that can be implicated are those involving decisions about transfers, assignments to jobs, and housing blocks, and overlooking minor infractions and rules. McCarthy distinguishes a number of forms of misuse of authority, including accepting gratuities for favorable consideration of an inmate's request, accepting gratuities for protecting illicit activities such as allowing gambling, drugs, prostitution in the facility, or protecting illicit activities from discovery or competition from other inmates. Extortion through mistreatment or harassment involves shaking down inmates and personally sanctioning inmates for refusing to obey instruction. Mismanagement includes operating prison industries for personal gain. A miscellaneous group including suspicious deaths of employees, concealment of prior criminal records by prospective employees, and charges of sexual coercion against a supervisor by a female employee. In the case of Dreyer versus Layette, those in prison testified that building tenders were given access to pipes, bats, and clubs to administer discipline on behalf of the regular officers. When personal authority extends to the entire prison system of a state, it can be obtained for personal benefit through the manipulation of procurement contracts. And provides several case studies of whistleblowing that had a positive effect on a correctional organization. In one case, a warden used institutional funds to purchase equipment he later used to operate a section of his cattle ranch. The warden also insisted that prison officers supervise inmate labor at his ranch while they operated his equipment. 2 officers complained, claiming that the warden had abused their authority, and their complaint was upheld by the State Personnel Board, which ruled that the prison officers had been required to act in ways that were unjustified and not relevant to their job descriptions. In 1997, a televised program of 60 Minutes reported cases of whistleblowing by 2 prison officers at a California prison that concerned what they believed to be unethical conduct by fellow officers. They claimed that inmates from different ethnical groups in the prison had been set up to fight each other in small prison exercise yards, and that it was not unusual for officers to place bets on the outcome of such fighting. In September of 2014, the Miami Herald reported that a senior inspector in the State Department of Corrections, who, with 3 other officers, had exposed misconduct in the fatal gassing of an individual by prison officers in an isolated cell at the Franklin Correctional Institution in 2010, and had been demoted with a 5% pay cut. He was then reinstated 5 hours later following the report of his promotion in the Miami Herald. In the mid-1980s, a female officer at a medium security prison reported to her fellow officers for sleeping on the night shift, claiming she had approached them and advised them that she felt unsafe and vulnerable while they slept. They continued to sleep, she reported them, and the consequences for her were severe in that she was later the subject of graffiti on the prison walls and received abusive phone calls and letters, and her car was deliberately damaged in the parking lot. The United States lacks a comprehensive and effective system for monitoring and regulating jail conditions and activities, which renders whistleblowing a relatively ineffective approach to inspecting prisons. Under the Federal Prison Litigation Reform Act in 1995, state and municipal governments now have the option to stop judicial oversight of their correctional institution. Many states enacted their own version of the PLRA, the main provision of which is complaints cannot be litigated unless there has first been an attempt to resolve them internally through a grievance procedure. Inmates must pay court fees in full. After 3 suits or appeals are dismissed on the grounds that they are frivolous, the individual cannot file another lawsuit where he or she will not be liable for the cost. Individuals cannot file a lawsuit for mental or emotional injury alone. There must also be a physical injury. The effect of the PLRA has been to reduce the number of court filings by more than 50% compared to the number of cases filed per every 1,000 individuals in prisons nationally. Private prisons are subjected to even less oversight than public prisons and are not subject to state Freedom of Information Acts or the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. Monitoring may reveal issues that are both obvious and hidden, provide political will to lighten sentences, and help foster trust between prison officials and prison gangs. Probation remains a widely employed sanction within the United States. At year-end 2020, an estimated 3,890,000 people were under community supervision, a reduction from 276,500 from January 1st of 2022. The workload of probation and parole has dramatically increased with the rise of intensive probation supervision. Probation and parole functions are commonly considered a component of corrections because both functions are concerned with the management and control of former inmates. A study conducted examined the tasks of probation officers in a medium-sized Tri-County probation department in a Southwest state. The study highlights that probation work has become increasingly intrusive due to the integration of various monitoring tools facilitated by technology. These tools include 24-hour alcohol monitoring, global position technology, ignition interlock devices equipped with cameras, as well as substance use testing through hair, skin, and fingerprint analysis. According to the survey, administrative chores made up the majority of the caseload tasks, while face-to-face interactions accounted for just 31% of the time for specialized officers, 25% for normal police, and 17% for county officers. Probation and parole officers must concern themselves with ethical issues, and their association has developed a code of ethics. Ethical issues in probation and parole tend to center on tensions between the role of probation and parole as treatment or as punishment, the supposed ineffectiveness of probation and parole as a result of or as a form of punishment, and concerns relative to the duty of these officers towards their clients. The supervision role begins to bring to the force the conflict between treatment and control function, or, as some would describe it, between surveillance and services. Some argue that parole is more surveillance than service-oriented because, for example, officers are instructed to make surprise visits to parolees. Some argue that this tension can be eliminated by giving the surveillance function to the police and leave probation officers to provide services. Other studies found that probation officers provide neither services nor surveillance, but in effect function primarily as report writers for the courts. Another study proposed a topography of probation officer style for their work, comprising the law enforcement model, the therapeutic model, and the synthetic model. The law enforcement model involves a primary role for public protection. The therapeutic model sees rehabilitation and aids the offender as central, and the synthetic model is a blend of both of these. Parole has always had a greater law enforcement emphasis than probation. Probation and parole officers are faced with decisions about whether to emphasize the protection of society or to aid the offender, and they are also accountable to demands from administrators and politicians about how their duties should be carried out. In many states, probation agencies are located in the executive branch of the government, where they operate as rational bureaucracy agents far removed from the probation officers in the field. This separation has the potential to create conflicts with the officers. When probation is located within the judicial branch of the government, there is less likely to be an administrative pressure on the probation work because the supervision and treatment functions may be considered subordinate to sentencing and punishment. States, the role of probation officers have gained new law enforcement emphasis, and probation officers in identifying more closely with law enforcement agencies. It is now common for probation officers to be proactive in enforcing probation conditions through measures such as monitoring, surveillance, search and seizure, drug testing, or even accompanying police on enforcement activities. Legally, a probation or parole officer may ask law enforcement personnel for assistance in searching their probationers, but the primary purpose of that search must be related to probation or parole and must not coverage for any other police purposes. A probationer frequently must consent to giving up their Fourth Amendment rights and allowing searches of their person's home and vehicle as a condition of probation. Today, police rely on probation officers for information about the probationer, their place of residence, living situation, and behavior, and in return, the probationer looks to law enforcement for protection when brought into contact with those who are high risk. A major ethical debate within the probation field concerns the issue of arming probation officers. Some argue that carrying a weapon makes it harder for a probation officer to successfully carry out their customary duties since it fosters mistrust between them and their clients. On the other side, police are more focused on the enforcement and often see carrying a gun as a means to reduce risk, especially when there is a tendency to associate with high-risk or violent criminals. The increased arming of probation officers might have unintended consequences of making them more closely resembling police officers than probation officers, which would further erode any remaining role in providing treatment. The ACA's view on this issue is that there have been a demonstrated need for firearms, and once this need is clear, adequate and ongoing training in the use must be provided. In the federal system, the majority of the jurisdictions permit federal probation officers from carrying arms. We're now going to look at if probation and parole are considered to be treatment or control. Treatment is de-emphasized and security tends to be stressed. The notion that probation is granted for the purpose of treatment persists, and a goal of probation remains one of matching the probationer with treatment and rehabilitative services within their community. Probation officers are challenged ethically in terms of having to choose who among their clients will receive adequate treatment services, especially as their caseload continues to rise. This is something that is a little bit different than what your textbook is teaching in actual practice. All probationers are required to complete treatment if it is ordered by the judge, and it does not matter how many people are on their caseload who is able to complete those services. Associated with the problems in supervising large caseloads and decisions about treatment responsibilities are the increased demands for and time constraints in preparation of pre-sentence investigation reports. For this, most agencies have swapped how they do their supervision. So supervision is done by supervising probation officers, and pre-sentence investigations are done by pre-sentence investigation writers. So they have two different tasks. With very large caseloads, officers may well lack the time to prepare detailed pre-sentence reports and may have to trade off one offender against another in the interest of performance. Again, different from what your textbook says, this is not something that is done in true traditional practice. have been questions about privatizing probation. One ethical issue affecting probation has been the granting of contracts to private companies to supervise persons ordered to pay low-level fines on people who are placed on probation. Much like prison privatization, therefore, in some states, the services of probation have been contracted out to private enterprises as a cost-saving measure. This is only done in certain instances with low-level administrative or low-risk offenders. CSRA Probation Service is a private company providing probation and other services, and it states that it is equally qualified to provide a wide array of community supervision options to local courts, communities, and cities. In Florida, Washington, Tennessee, these corporations were founded in 1997 and in 2006 had secured more than 100 contracts for community supervision services. Again, this is for services provided to probation. They are not doing the actual supervision of probation. In Alabama, the city of Clairton contracts probation out to the Judicial Correctional Services, a large private probation company in Alabama. It has been claimed that the private probation industry marks a return to the debtor's prison of times past, when it is permissible to imprison persons for non-payment of debts. The laws of numerous states provide for several categories of fees that include supervision fees. Supervision fees vary among the level of supervision and the characteristics of the offense. Supervision fees are often returned to state agencies and used to fund community supervision services. These fees are also not imposed by every single state, and some only impose supervision fees to those who they supervise from an outside state. Parole is still available under state and federal law. It is increasingly difficult to secure, especially for life sentences. Since 2008, under Marsy's law, the interval between successive parole applications followed by a rejected application has been fixed at between 3 and 15 years, as determined by the Board of Parole, with an average waiting time of 5 years. Treatment programs for parolees are scarce, and parole officers focus their efforts on surveillance rather than rehabilitation. Again, differing from your textbook, this is not necessarily the practice of South Dakota. We do put most of our parolees through treatment services, and we are working on that more than surveillance. Safety and security are now major issues in parole services and in large urban areas. Parole agents are commonly occupied with drug testing, electronic monitoring, and verifying curfews. Again, a lot of these services are able to be conducted by other agencies. Drug testing can be done through 24/7, and electronic monitoring and varying curfews is easy to do with a technology piece now. In some states, there are significant numbers of people who are on both probation and parole. In the state of South Dakota, you are only allowed to be on probation or parole. You cannot be on both at the same time. Partly due to zero-tolerance policies, a great number of parole violations are being detected, and revocations to prison is becoming a routine affair because the process of being sent back to prison, later released on parole, and then sent back again to prison sets up a revolving door for parolees. Many U.S. states have laws that allow for sentences of life in prison without parole to be imposed. Life in prison without parole is a lifetime sentence where an individual with this sentence will spend the rest of his or her life in prison. C's remind us that there are other ways to keep people in jail until their death. Many scholars now contend that the life without parole sentence calls into question the morality of punishment and the value of human life. In the words of Jonathan Simon, he defines the logic of contemporary penalty in its embrace of a totalizing promise of prison, implication that extends to the very limits of life and unmediated by any further consideration of the prisoner as a distinct human being. The widespread use of life in prison without the possibility of parole as a punishment elevates it to the status of an unremarkable part of the sentence toolkit of the United States. Henry argues that such sentence constitutes uniquely severe and degrading punishments because of the nature of the punishment itself, because they deny human dignity, and because they are de facto irrecoverable. Whole life sentences are often regarded as worse than a death sentence because they allow for extended periods of suffering, failure to respect the worth and dignity of the individual, and they deny all reparative responsibilities. The Council of Europe has declared that imprisoning a person for life without the hope of release is inhumane and incompatible with the idea of reintegrating prisoners into society. While the U.S. Supreme Court has generally supported life sentences, in 2010 in Graham v. Florida, the court for the first time held that a non-capital sentence was a violation of the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The court struck down the use of life in prison without the possibility of parole for a juvenile convicted of offenses other than homicide. In this case, a 16-year-old boy had committed an armed robbery and received probation, which he then violated. The court noted that life in prison without the possibility of parole was the second most severe penalty under the law and said that it had deprived a convicted person of the most basic liberties without giving them a hope of restoration. Issues of overcrowding in prisons have led to the expanded use of community-based corrections and have resulted in a shift of the prison overpopulation issue rather than resolving. The conflict between treatment and control responsibilities has been predominantly addressed in favor of control for parole officers. The role of a parole officer has shifted to that of a police officer, given that both possess the legal power to carry and utilize firearms, conduct searches without being bound by the Fourth Amendment, make arrests without requiring probable cause, and detain individuals without granting them bail.